Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for one of my favorite videos every time we have a new set. I'm joined today by Tomer, and what are we going to be talking about today, Tomer?
Hey Seth, today we're going to be talking about the Aether Revolt cards and how they will function in Commander. So we're doing a Commander review of Aether Revolt.
Yeah, so we're going to be breaking down the top 10 cards from Aether Revolt for Commander, and Tomer and I were talking a little bit while I was getting the video ready to go, and you said a couple really interesting things about the set in general for Commander. So what is your overall impression of Aether Revolt in Commander before we get to the top 10?
I would say it has the highest concentration of cards that I'm excited to play with in a set as basically ever. We counted it. I'm interested in playing with 25 of these cards, like immediately when the set comes out. 25, that is an enormous list. It was very difficult for me to just narrow it down to top 10 for this. And then we looked at the set size. It's only 184 cards compared to Kaladish's like 260 or so.
Yeah.
And there's more cards here that I'm excited for than I was even for Kaladesh, the bigger set.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
That's really insane. I've been working on the expected value article for Aether Revolt, so I've been looking at the numbers, and there's 54 rares and mythics, and I assume you probably have some uncommons on your list of cards you want to play, but most of them are probably rares and mythics, which means that's nearly half of the rares and mythics from Aether Revolt. You're at least somewhat interested in playing in Commander, which has to be one of the best Commander hit rates, or whatever you want to call it, of any set of all time. That's just absurd. That means like every other card, every other rare and mythic almost is something that's sweet for Commander. So I'm really excited to do this video. I always have fun doing them anyway, but this one should be even better than normal because we have a ton of sweet cards to talk about. So I guess we'll get right to it, and we're doing a top 10 and we're counting them down. So number 10 on our list, we get to start with a blue card, and you know I like this one because it has my favorite text on it: you win the game, mechanized production. So Tomer, my question with this one is this a card that you like because you plan on winning the game with it, or do you like it because it's kind of like a progenitor mimic, something that can copy a card repeatedly every single turn?
I think, well, I'm more interested in the you win the game. I love those type of cards. I know you love those type of cards, Seth. And I'm always very excited about a you win the game card that isn't really hard to pull off. Like, there's some that are really janky, and it's going to be such an uphill battle to pull it off. Like, most recently, Triskaidekaphobia is just insanely hard to pull off in Commander, especially when people are running fetch lands and stuff. So even if you do get them to 13 life to trigger you lose the game clause, it's almost impossible to pull off. Mechanized production, however, is actually really easy to pull off. We have a lot of ways of pulling it off in Commander, which sounds a bit weird in a singleton format because you can't really copy, like, let's say, an Eternal Witness that easily and get 8 copies of them on the field and win the game off that, because just of deck building restrictions. It does work off tokens. So we have a lot of ways making token artifacts and making 8 of them to actually trigger the ability. We could do it off mirrors with cards like Shrine of Loyal Legions, or Mirror Incubator, or Mirror Battle Sphere, or a combination of all those. We have a lot of ways of making Thopters, like Brea Ethereum Shaper, Sharding Sphinx, and a bunch of others. We have clues even. We can make clue tokens with Tireless Tracker and other clue generators. So there's a lot of options. Or we could even win with like basic islands using Mycosynth Lattice, turning all our permanents into artifacts. So it's actually really easy to get that clause ready. And like you said, it also has value even outside of just winning the game for you, because it does act as an engine copying an artifact.
Yeah, if there's one card type, I guess, if you want to call it that, I have a lot of experience with, it's you win the game cards, and one of the hallmarks of those cards throughout Magic's entire history is they are incredibly high variance. They do literally nothing, for most of the game until their claws triggers, and then they do literally everything and you win the game. So they just sit out and do nothing. If you look at basically any of them, the cycle where you need like 50 or more life or 20 creatures in your graveyard, the test of endurance and those cards, really any of the you win the game cards printed throughout Magic's history, that's how they're formatted. This one is really unique because it does do something even when it's not winning you the game, and the something is actually relatively powerful. I mean, even just putting this on a soul ring is going to gain you a lot of mana, and that's probably about the floor of this card, putting it on a random mana rock. There's some powerful artifacts if you imagine like Solemn Simulacrum and Duplicant and Panharmonicon. And because Commander is a singleton format, being able to copy things is really powerful and kind of breaks one of the rules of the format that you only get one of each effect. So I'm really excited about it for both halves. I like copying things, and this is a pretty sweet way to do it. And you can just randomly win the game, either intentionally because you're comboing off with Mycosynth Lattice or Clue tokens, or just unintentionally in the right situation where you just copy things for a bunch of turns and eventually that wins you the game. If you can put this on a hexproof artifact or something that has some amount of protection, or an indestructible artifact, you might just be able to kind of play the control game and slowly build up until you win the game. So I'm really excited for this one too.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's flexible, it's useful in all stages of the games, even if you're not using it to win the game. And it's only 4 mana as an enchantment. It's not that expensive, not that huge of an investment. And another way to just also win out of nowhere, it goes very well with flash effects, because the you win the game trigger actually happens at your upkeep. So one way you can do it is you can just play it at sorcery speed like usual, and then wait like an entire turn for it to come around for you to actually win the game, if you do have enough tokens ready. And you're in blue, so you have counter magic to protect it, so that's not impossible by any stretch. But you're also in blue, so you could also run flash effects to play at an instant speed right before the beginning of your upkeep. You can use Leyline of Anticipation, which is a blue enchantment that gives all your non-land cards flash. And there's also the same thing as a colorless artifact form, Vidalcan Orrery. So those are just 2 more options to make sure that your win the game trigger happens more often.
And that's not even to mention that you're in blue, so you also have all the take an extra turn spells. So you can get this on something and just take an extra turn, and then it becomes your upkeep right away when you pass the turn, and no one gets to do anything at sorcery speed. So
blue great.
Blue is wonderful. Well, for our next card, we are moving away from blue and going to talk about a green instant. This is Heroic Intervention. So, Tomer, what do you think about this one?
So, 2 of my favorite cards that I always jam into my white decks whenever applicable are 2 cards that give my creatures indestructible. The first one is Boros Charm, which has a couple different modes. One deals 4 damage to target player, you're never going to use that. Permanents you control are indestructible this turn, amazing. And then target creature gets double strike until end of turn, which is also quite useful. But I almost always run Boros Charm these days for the ability to make my permanents indestructible. And then the other card is Rootborn Defenses, makes your creatures indestructible and you can populate. Both of these, I'm using them for the indestructibility ability, because in Commander, there's a lot of board wipes. Whenever you have a threatening board, or somebody else has a threatening board, someone is going to be itching to wipe the board. And the greatest thing you can do in response to that is to make sure that all of your permanents are indestructible in response to the board wipe, because then everybody scoops up their permanents while you're left with your permanents still on the field. And that is a huge game changer. That could take you from a losing position to actually a winning position if you're the only person with permanents on the board and everybody else has to do catch up with you. So it is an insanely strong just response to a board wipe. And Heroic Interventions actually goes one further. It makes your permanents also hexproof. So suddenly, it also protects from targeted removal spells like Swords of Plowshares and Return to Dust. So it's flexible, and it's only 2 mana. So it just is a really good response in a color that doesn't have counter magic, doesn't have stuff like counterspell. This card saves your board and is also better than counter spells in response to wraths.
Yeah, I think the having the hexproof as well is definitely a big upside, and as you mentioned, it hits all your permanents. So this does keep your enchantments and mana rocks and all that stuff alive. No matter what your opponent's targeting, this is pretty much going to save the day. So that part of it is super helpful, and I think that it could also have some potential of being played with those cards. I know you have Boros Charm, which can do it, but you can play a Wrath of God and make your own stuff indestructible and kill all your opponent's stuff, or play an Armageddon and blow up all your opponent's lands, but since you have Heroic Intervention, your lands aren't going anywhere. So there's some neat combos there too. I think the problem with Boros Charm is it puts you into red and white, so it limits the color combinations it can go into. So I like the potential of using it with some of those spells as well. So do you think that's a legit plan in Commander, Tomer? Like, would you build around this to try to destroy all of your opponent's stuff, or is this just to save you from what your opponent's doing?
I think definitely it synergizes well with your own board wipes because it just costs 2 mana. So as long as you have enough mana for your board wipe plus 2, so let's say Wrath of God is 4, and then you pay an additional 2 for Heroic Intervention, it is a combo that is devastating in the right circumstances.
Moving on to number 8 on our list, we are heading back to the blue cards, and we have a pretty sweet tutor. This is Trophy Mage. So we've had Trinket Mage, we've had Treasure Mage, now we have Trophy Mage, which is kind of in between the two. What do you think about being able to tutor for a 3 converted mana cost artifact in Commander, Tomer?
Well, Trinket Mage has always been a classic staple in Commander. We always know that at the very least, it can tutor up Sol Ring, it can tutor up a Relic of Progenitus, a Mana Crypt, a bunch of useful things. Trophy Mage does the same thing and possibly more. It might be even stronger than Trinket Mage. I did a short list of stuff that it can pick up, and some of the stuff could be Chromatic Lantern, in case you want to do some ramp and mana fixing. You can do Crucible of Worlds, which is great for any land recursion deck, or just really good with fetch lands. So Get Rog Monster will love it for sure. Mimic Vat is great utility for just copying creatures that would have ended up in the graveyard. Ashnod's Altar, Sacrifice Engine / Combo Engine. Cloudstone Curio, again, Infinite Bounce Engine, great for Animar. Rings of Bright Hearth, copy your activated abilities, great in basically everything. Crystal Shard, so you can bounce your Trophy Mage and then replay her and get something else. Trinisphere for stacks people, Phyrexian Altar, all the Swords cards like Swords and Fire Ice. So there's a lot of utility here. It's probably more exciting than Trinket Mage, honestly. And a lot of decks are going to be very interested in this card, I would say.
Yeah, I really love the flexibility. With this, as you mentioned, going through that list of cards, almost no matter what situation you're in, you can get something really powerful. Swords are great pretty much all the time, and the ability to tutor up the right sword for the right occasion, if you're playing multiple swords in your deck, is actually a really powerful effect. Being able to get the combo pieces if you're a combo deck, or as a default, you can always get your Chromatic Lantern or a Basalt Monolith, which can also be a combo piece, and some sort of ramp effect. So there's going to be very few situations where you're going to cast a Trophy Mage and be disappointed with what you're finding, I think.
Yeah, I think as long as you have 2 or more artifacts a Trophy Mage can tutor up, she's a very good option for you to consider. If you have 3 or more, then she's just amazing.
And plus, as you mentioned, some of those cards are directly combo pieces, and in those scenarios, it's probably worth it to play it, even if it's the only card you can get. If you're setting up an infinite combo with Ashnod's Altar, and that's your only 3 converted mana cost artifact, you're willing to sometimes draw your Trophy Mage and have it just be a 2/2 for 3, if you know that in a lot of games, it's going to be getting a potentially game-ending combo piece for you.
Yeah, I could already mention off the bat a card that she's going to be an auto-occlude in. Animar Soul of Elements. Loves Cloudstone Curio. It's one of the ways Animar just wins infinitely, usually just bouncing two colorless creatures, or just like anything they can play for free, and then having like a Perforos, God of the Forge on the battlefield. So each time the creature re-enters the battlefield, Perforos does 2 damage to each opponent, and you just win the game off that by doing infinite burn. So Trophy Mage in Animar is pay 1 blue, fetch up your combo piece, and then win the game. It is absurd.
Yeah, it seems pretty powerful.
Yeah, and other decks too, like Brago King Eternal. It's a blink that loves bounce effects, loves Crystal Shard, loves Cloudstorm Courier as well. Basically, any sacrifice deck loves Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar, so these are just really good ways of getting them. And then, of course, Trophy Mage in the sacrifice deck would also be just sacrifice fodder herself. So
it sounds like Trophy Mage fits in a lot of places, and a lot of those things you just mentioned are really popular in Commander. So it's not only does it fit in a lot of decks, it fits into good decks that people want to play.
Yeah, of all the cards in this entire list, I feel like Trophy Mage is going to be the card that gets played the most.
Well, let's move on to a card that I was a little surprised was on this list until I read it a second time. We have Dark Intimations, the Nicol Bolas flavored spell, even though there's no Nicol Bolas, at least yet, in Standard. So, Tomer, what do you envision with this one? Does the bottom half of the text that references Nicol Bolas, is that part of why you like this card, or are you just playing it for its spell effect?
I have to admit that I love flavor. I am a big Vorthos person, and I love Nicol Bolas flavored cards. He's just a really cool villain. He is your stereotypical villain, but he just takes it to the extreme. He's also a dragon villain. It's just great. I love Nicol Bolas, and this is a Nicol Bolas card. So I already got really excited. Cruel Ultimatum is one of my favorite cards from back in the day, and this kind of echoes Cruel Ultimatum. It scales in multiplayer, so each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, then discards a card, and then you return a creature or planeswalker card from your hand, and then draw a card. So the sacrifice plus discard is actually really relevant that it hits every single opponent, because in a typical 4-player game, you're going to be hitting 3 opponents with this. So 3 people are probably going to be sacrificing a creature and discarding cards. So that's basically like they're 6 cards down, and you're 2 cards up if you get a creature or a planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand and you draw a card. That's crazy good value. That's exactly why I like cards like, oh no, now I'm blanking out. There's a black card that, Siphon Mind. Siphon Mind makes every opponent discard a card, and you draw a card for each card discarded this way. I love that card for 4 mana. This is a similar type of value. Hitting creatures is very easy. So most likely you're going to be getting 6 cards down on your opponents and 2 cards up for yourself. And then, yes, the second part, you do get to get a Nicol Bolas Planeswalker card back from your graveyard to your hand. You get to cast a Nicol Bolas card and get a loyalty counter on it. We only have 1 Nicol Bolas Planeswalker card right now. Hopefully we get a second one when Amoket comes out. We're not really sure yet, but it does have very cute synergy with Nicol Bolas, the Planeswalker that we have right now. Nicol Bolas usually starts with 5 loyalty counters. He has a +3 ability, and he can ultimate with a -9. His ultimate's very powerful. It deals 7 damage to target player, and then that player discards 7 cards and sacrifices 7 permanents. It is brutal. But the key thing is that if you just play Nicol Bolas by himself, he takes 2 turns to get to his ultimate. With this, however, it bumps his starting loyalty from 5 to 6. So it only takes 1 turn for him to be ready to ultimate. You start at 6, you +3 him, so you're at 9, and then the next turn after, he is ready to ultimate. So it is a huge difference for the Planeswalker as well.
I did not realize that it had that synergy with the existing Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. I was hoping that there would be something like that with the new one, where the loyalty, 1 additional loyalty would really matter. Otherwise, the card just looks so weird in a standard legal set, but it makes a lot of sense retroactively with the original Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. I think for me with this card, I was so down on it as someone who had been evaluating it from the context of standard and so forth, that I kind of looked right over the fact that it does say each opponent, and that does make it a lot more reasonable for a Commander game. I still think I'm not a huge fan. The problem with this one is I think it really only goes in a specific deck. Being Grixis colored, we're talking about so many colorless and 1-colored cards in this set. Being 3 colors just really minimizes the number of spots you can do this. I guess if you're playing Grixis, and especially if you're playing Grixis with Nicol Bolas Planeswalker, that this could be a part of it. But I expect that this will be one of the the least played cards on our list, if not because of the card itself, because of the very specific color restrictions that are involved with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I am totally biased when reviewing and ranking this card. This is more a ranking of stuff Tomer is most excited for, just for anybody viewing. I'm excited about 25 cards. Had to get the top 10 most, and obviously Dark Intimations is one of the cards I'm most excited for. And obviously, if you are running this card, I think it's good by itself in a Grixis deck, but you have to go all the way. You have to run Nicol Bolas Planeswalker as well. It is a requirement.
All right, moving on to number 6 on our list, a card that is not flavored with Nicol Bolas at all. We have Rishkar's Expertise. So, Tomer, what do you want to do with this one? Is this one exciting because you get to cast something for free, or because it draws you a bunch of cards? Or both, I guess.
Honestly, it's both. I think any big creature deck will love this. Two decks that love big creatures, for example, is Xenagos, God of Revels, which takes your creature, whatever creature it is, and doubles its size and gives it haste and sends it running at your opponent's face. And there's also Mael of the Anima, who cares about creatures that are power 5 or greater. These are just big creature type decks. And Selvala, the new Selvala 2 cares about big creature sizes as well. These cards, these decks love drawing cards equal to their creature's power. 2 cards that I find are staple in my own Xenagos deck is Hunter's Insight and Hunter's Prowess. Both of them draw cards equal to the damage dealt, equal to the amount of damage the target creature deals. And Rishkar's Expertise is kind of similar to that. It's also similar to Soul's Majesty, which is another draw card equal to target creature's power. Rishkar's Expertise is very similar to those cards where if you have a big creature on the field, you're going to be drawing a whole bunch of cards of these green card draw spells. They're very much stuck with these creatures. Rishkar's Expertise is a little bit safer. You're paying 1 more mana for the luxury of drawing cards, but it doesn't target a creature, so your opponents can't just take out the targeted creature and then the spell fizzles. Even if they take out your biggest creature, you're still going to draw cards off your second biggest creature, assuming you have one on the field. The next part is, yes, you get to cast a card for free. So first you draw all these cards. You probably don't have that much mana to cast all your spells, and if you don't have a Reliquary Tower out or some other way of keeping all those cards in your hand, you're going to start discarding cards. So that doesn't always feel the greatest when you're drawing like 7 cards and you have to immediately go to your end step and then start discarding stuff. Rishkar's Expertise says you draw all your cards, and then you get to cast one of them for free, and its mana cost 5 or less. You're probably going to be casting a 5 mana spell and getting full value out of it. That's a lot of value out of a 6 mana.
Yeah, there's some pretty neat tricks just thinking of it in the context of a Xenagos list. There's some very powerful 5-drops that you can immediately put down with this card, assuming you draw into them. And if you have a Xenagos out, you can immediately attack with them. And I'm thinking stuff like Phyrexian Hydra, which is a 7/7 Infector. If you have haste and double that up, you just kill someone out of nowhere with infect damage. There's also Malignance, which is super huge, potentially, maybe enough to one-shot someone. And Deuce of Calamity destroys a land, and it would also be a 12/12 trample if you double it up. So there's some really interesting options, specifically in the context of a Xenagos deck that you can hopefully draw into, especially if an active Xenagos, you're going to draw 6 cards at least, presumably, and then hopefully draw into one of these game-ending 5-drops. And I'm sure there's even more if you really go through the list of some really good targets that can potentially, Skitherix, I guess, doesn't work with Xenagos, but that's another scary 5-drop that you could put into play with this in the right build. So I think there's some game-ending combo potential almost with getting to cast the card for free. And when you look at it in that context, where you're probably going to play your Malignus or Phyrexian Hydra or whatever anyway, it kind of becomes 1 mana draw cards equal to the greatest power of creatures you control, because you get that 5 mana back when you play a spell for free. Moving on to the top 5 of our list, we're staying with the Rishkar theme, and we have Rishkar himself? Rishkar Prima Renegade. So my first thought with this one is Seaton Krosan Protector, Tomer. I don't know if you see that comparison. What do you think with this card?
I think that's a good comparison, actually. He's kind of like a archetype support card. In this case, he helps the +1/+1 archetype, and he immediately lets your creatures tap for mana. It's very similar to like Cryptolith Rite, which came out in Shadows over Innistrad. Oh no, Eldritch Moon. Sorry. That it's an enchantment. It says creatures you control. Say you can tap them to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Basically, turns them all into Birds of Paradise, which is great. It's also very similar to like Earthcraft, for example, which is the exact same thing. Rishgar at the very least, he's just making 2 of your creatures, gives them ability to tap for mana, but he gives them +1/+1 counters. So he's really, really good for the +1/+1 counter archetype. Not only does he add counters to people so that they can benefit from +1/+1 counter synergies, but he also adds synergies to creatures that already have +1/+1 counters on them. So in a +1/+1 counter archetype, which is getting really hard to say, by the way, he just starts letting all your creatures tap for mana, and that's amazing, especially if like they can't swing in or do anything else relevant with them. You can just ramp out really big threats. So I think it's really good for Atraxa decks that love those counters, or other decks like Experiment Crage that love counters as well.
So I gotta ask with this one, since it is a legendary creature, is this in consideration as commander for any deck? Is it possible to be mono green +1/+1 counters, or would this be in the conversation if you're going to be elf tribal or druid tribal, or is this just purely a 99 card?
I think he's all right for a mono green deck. I haven't actually looked at all the cards that work with the +1/+1 theme in mono green, but there is I think probably the most cards fit in there. I just think he would do a lot better as part of the 99.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you, and I think as far as the tribal aspects, I have a hard time imagining that this would be better than some of the legendary elves and some of the legendary druids out there, if you're going to go with the tribal aspect of it. But it is a really sweet card, and the fact that it can have an ability that in some ways has haste. This is almost like Rishkar's expertise we were just talking about. If you cast this for 3 mana and put 2 +1/+1 counters on other creatures you have, you immediately get 2 of that mana back because you can use it. So in some sense, it's a lot cheaper than it even looks. And of course, you can always just put a counter on itself and make it into a 3/3 that's also a mana dork. And that's disregarding all the synergies. Turning all of your Nissa Voice of Zendikar activations or Oath of Ajani activations or any of the stuff that puts counters on things into not only spells that make your creatures bigger, but also turn them into Llanowar elves or Elvish mystics, mana dorks, is a really powerful effect and can do some really explosive things. If you can go wide with tokens or something, have an effect that puts counters on everything, you're potentially going to be +5, 10 mana when you cast Rishkar, and you can use that mana right away because other creatures won't be summoning sick and potentially play something massive right away. So I really like the potential of Rishkar in decks that can really go wide and put a bunch of counters on things.
Yeah, absolutely. He's so mana efficient for what he's doing, and he's doing 2 things really well. He's enabling +1/+1 synergies, and he's a +1/+1 synergy enabler himself. And he does both for just 3 mana, and like you said, you can get 2 of that mana back immediately if you so chose.
Moving on to the top 4 of our list, we have kind of the parade of legendary creatures. Next we have Baral, Chief of Compliance. So Tomer, first question, is this legend a commander or another 99 card?
I would say both. I'm putting him in basically every Spellslinger deck with blue that I'll ever make, and that's pretty much all the Spellslinger decks I ever make are always in blue, so yeah, he is a staple in the Spellslinger archetype, and he is very good as a commander or as a 99. He's basically, the closest comparison would be Goblin Electromancer, which also is a 2-mana creature. It's a 2/2. It says instants or sorceries spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and it is an Izzet color, so you have to be in blue and red to cast it. Baral is monocolored, easier to cast, has that ability, But also, whenever a spell or ability control counters a spell, you may draw a card and then discard a card. So he is a looter if you play with counter magic, which Spellslinger decks often do, and blue is very good at doing. So it's just a win-win situation here. I think he's going to be excellent as a commander, probably better than my other favorite mono blue commander for Spellslingers, Talrand Sky Summoner. Talrand is a win condition because whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you make a 2/2 Drake with flying. So he can actually provide chump blockers and then eventually win the game. But Talrand is 4 mana, and he doesn't really do anything until you start casting instants or sorceries. Baral is only 2 mana, so he gets to be played a lot more, and it's not as devastating if you lose him because you can recast him. And he makes your instants or sorceries a lot cheaper too, so you can play Baral, and then you might have more mana available to protect him with counters. And if you do counter, then you get to loot. And then you get to play more instants or sorceries, and then you can counter more stuff. It's amazing. It's kind of like Goblin Electromancer meets Jace Vryn's Prodigy in a way. He is bonkers.
Yeah, it seems very strong. I could imagine this being the commander of combo type decks where making your instants and sorceries cheaper is really powerful. Anything with a lot of spells, it's good. And of course, what I want to most do with it is just play the counter spell deck. That's Baral is my commander, and then approximately like 45 counter spells in my deck, and maybe like a win condition or something, and just make everyone at the table hate me. And it's really powerful. One of the things with counter spells is the way you kind of can lose with a strategy that's really heavy on counters is you run out of action. Like once you're especially in Commander where you have 3 different opponents, sooner or later you're going to have an opponent or multiple opponents that can get threats through because they have more threats than you have counter spells. But the ability to loot away extra land draws when you counter something to presumably find more counters is really important, and that's going to help you stay in that game plan a lot longer because you're going to have more counters to hopefully match up with your opponent's threats. So it's really cool to see a counter spell lord almost in Baral. But I'm definitely very interested in playing it, and it's super efficient. That's one thing I've learned over the course of Commander Clash is commanders that are 2 mana, 3 mana get a big bump in playability because you can cast them and recast them and recast them when if you play a 6 or 8 mana commander, if your opponent just kills it, which they probably will have a removal spell by that point, and you tap out, it's so mana intensive and so difficult to actually get your commander back on the battlefield. With Baral, you can just cast it on turn 2. If it dies, recasting it for 4 mana or even 6 mana the second time isn't that big of a deal.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That is an inherent problem with the more expensive commanders. And that's just the inherent advantage of the cheaper ones is that you can always count on Baral to come out on turn 2. You can always count on replaying him over and over again. And it's only useful if it's cheap enough to recast over and over again. That's the problem with having Avacyn Archangel of Hope as your commander. She's 8 mana, and sure, she's amazing at protecting your board state, but she's most likely going to be much better off as part of the 99 because realistically, you're not going to be able to cast her more than once or twice in a game. So Baral gets the nod from me over someone like Talrand even, who's just 4 mana. That's not crazy. But since he's 2 mana, that means he's just that much better in the command zone spot, I would say.
Well, speaking of cheap commanders, number 3 on our list, we have another 2-mana commander, and it really says something, knowing that Tomer and I are the people that made this list, primarily Tomer, that the mono white legend just beat out the mono blue legend in our commander ranking. That tells you that this card must be really insane. So we have SRAM Senior Edificer and Tomer. What are you planning on doing with this one?
Okay, I have one thing that I'm going to be doing with it, and it's going to be drawing cards. For people who are new to the reviews or new to Commander Clash, one thing that I like to do in Commander more than everything else is draw cards. And SRAM does it amazingly, and in mono white of all things. And mono white is probably the color that has the worst card draw historically in Commander. So this is the most exciting card in mono white for a long, long time for me. Strom, instead of the loot effect with Baral, who only loots if you counter something, Strom draws you a card, and it's either an aura, an equipment, or a vehicle spell when you cast it. It's fantastic, and I think what he does is not only does he work very well as 99 in, let's say, a Boros deck that wants to be equipment heavy and you want to get more fuel out of your cards because you're just lacking in card draw. He's also really good as a commander. He's really good as a mono white, possibly a control deck, even a mono white control deck. He's available on turn 2, which we already talked about. Baral is a huge upside for having a commander in your command zone. And he just turns all your equipments, all your auras, all your vehicles into cantrips. You just draw cards off them, you replace your cards, so you hopefully won't run out of steam midway through the game.
Yeah, I mean, at level 1, this is just a Pure Steel Paladin that can be in your command zone, and it does more than that. And Pure Steel Paladin and artifact-based decks are fairly popular, I think, in Commander. It's a fun archetype, but having that effect all the time instead of having to hope you draw into a Pure Steel Paladin, having that in your command zone is a really big deal, and it goes beyond that because you could play this in a sort of enchantment-centered, maybe, I don't know, Boggles archetype, some sort of Voltron-esque archetype where you're pumping up your creatures with auras, or pacifying your opponent's creatures and drawing cards. My question, though, Tomer, is, you play Commander more than I do, are there enough vehicles to make a real vehicle deck, or is that text kind of irrelevant at this point? Is it just maybe you randomly have a vehicle in your deck and get lucky, or can you build vehicle tribal?
Yeah, I kind of glossed over vehicles. I think overall, they just... This type doesn't really matter so much as individual cards for me. Vehicles as a concept is fine. I just haven't seen that many great vehicles that can stand up to in comparison to the equipments. Because in equipments we have the swords, we have like Argentum armor, we have a lot of really big splashy cards that are very efficient at what they do. So they have the bar very high. And unfortunately with vehicles, you only have one block's worth of them. And there's not too many off the top of my head that I would list that are that great. I think like Sky Sovereign is a great one. It's kind of like an Inferno Titan where it deals 3 damage when it enters the battlefield or when it attacks. So I would play that one with SRAM. But I can't think of too many off the top of my head that I would play otherwise. Maybe the Copter, Smuggler's Copter. Now that maybe the price goes down after that banning.
So, Tomer, is this the next commander that will lead to you failing to assemble Kaldra?
Absolutely. You heard it here, folks. I think he's great. He's great there. He's going to be great at failing for assembling Kaldra. I really like the aura effect, too. You mentioned that you could do Voltron, but you can also play more of the controlling removal type cards. One of my favorite removal spells in all of Commander is Darksteel Mutation. It turns the target creature into a 0/1 indestructible artifact with no other abilities. It's great at putting on your opponent's commander, and they're stuck without a commander. It doesn't go back to the command zone, so they can't recast it. They're just stuck with a 0/1 indestructible creature. But same thing like with Pacifism, or like Voltron cards, like Celestial Armor, where wherever you deal combat damage to a player, you double your life total. Like, there's a lot of things there. You could use equipments. And also, if you do want to run in a vehicle deck, I would highly recommend putting Srum in the vehicle commander deck, which is Depala, Pilot Exemplar. She's an amazing commander. There's not that many vehicles or dwarves to fully abuse her, but Srum is obviously the best card in her deck now.
All right, moving on to number 2 on our list, our final 2 cards, and amazingly enough, the number 2 card is an uncommon. We have Winding Constrictor. So, Tomer, is this card powerful on its own, or is it powerful because people really love +1/+1 counters, and it just slots into one of the most popular archetypes in all of Commander?
I think it's just a support card. Pure and simple, it is a 2/3 for 2. Doesn't have any special keywords on it. It's not going to be like a super beater or anything. It is just there to enable counter decks. And it's not just +1/+1 counters. It works with energy counters. It works with charged counters. So, for example, energy counters, Aether Flux, not Aether Flux Reservoir, Aether Flux,
Aetherworks Marvel? No.
Aetherworks Marvel. Yes, that one. It works with those type of cards. It works with +1/+1 cards, obviously, and it also works with charge cards like Lux Cannon, for example. So there's a lot of different ways to use counters. Also loyalty counters, Planeswalker decks, for example. Oh, wait, no, it doesn't work with that. Ignore that part. But it works with a lot of different counters. Atraxa Praetor's Voice has already shown herself to be the most popular commander out of all of them from the Commander 2016 line. So obviously counter decks are very, very popular. Winding Constrictor just fits with basically all of them except for loyalties. So I could just imagine it slotting into a lot of decks.
Yeah, it's one of the scary things about the +1/+1 counter decks is it's already a very supported archetype. Like, a lot of sets throughout Magic's history have had mechanics or at least cards that deal with +1/+1 counters. So you have a huge card pool to draw on. And in just the last couple years or few years, we had what was the Innistrad card that's sort of like a bad doubling season?
Parallel Lives?
Yeah, Parallel Lives. We've gotten Hardened Scales, which is another recent card. We have Winding Constrictor now. So there's been a lot of reasonable cards that you can just slot into these +1/+1 counter decks that really push them to the top of the meta. And that's not even counting Atraxa and what she does for those decks by giving them a commander that naturally works with it. So the +1/+1 archetype just keeps getting better and better. It's really kind of scary. So I think Hardened Scales is amazingly popular. If there's one bad card that I get more tweets and emails about than any other, it's probably Hardened Scales. And this is basically a Hardened Scales on a stick that's on curve with Hardened Scales. So I'm pretty excited to see what this card can do. I enjoy playing the +1/+1 counter archetype, and I'm pretty sure this is just an auto-include. Like, if you're playing it, there's no reason not to put this in your deck, and since it's uncommon, it's likely not going to be super expensive, which makes it a lot easier for budget players, like on Commander Clash, for us to be able to play this in our decks as well.
Yeah, a good indicator to see how popular Winding Constrictor is going to be in Commander is check the foil prices, because Commanders love their bling, and the only... I can imagine the foil price, if it's a very popular card, will end up being like $4 or something, which is pretty high for an uncommon. One thing to note is it is in black and green, so you are restricted in colors in what to put into what deck Winding Constrictor actually slots into. You can't just put it in any counter deck. So I see it as an auto-include in Atraxa decks, which is the most popular commander from Commander 2016. Also, Skullbriar. I love Skullbriar decks. He's a Voltron +1/+1 counter deck. This is an auto-include there. So any Golgari deck that focuses on counters on artifacts or creatures will love this.
All right, so we are moving on to our very last card, the #1 card from Aether Revolt for Commander. We have an artifact, Paradox Engine. So, Tomer, what do you plan on doing with this one?
I plan on doing unfair things with it, Seth. a lot of unfair things with it. Essentially, it is an insanely good mana accelerator when played fairly. When you're trying to play Paradox Engine fairly, it just basically says whenever you cast a spell, untap all your mana rocks. Oh, and by the way, all your creatures have like pseudo vigilance as well, because why not? That is at its like fairest way. You're not doing anything crazy with it. You're just playing Paradox Engine just the way it's supposed to be. If you want to take things a little bit further, you can start really abusing some of the mana rocks that they tap for a lot of mana, but the downside is that they require more mana to untap it. So Mana Vault, Grid Monolith, Basalt Monolith, all are super hyper efficient mana rocks the first time you tap it, but then they don't untap until you actually pay mana again to untap them. Paradox Engine takes away that disadvantage. So suddenly, if you pair Paradox Engine with Mana Vault, Grid Monolith, Basalt Monolith, you're making a lot of mana that you're not supposed to be making. So things get very crazy right off the bat. If you're in a green deck, you have probably a lot of mana dorks like Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, or if you're using like Earthquake, Cryptolife right. These cards all get way better when you have Paradox Engine. And then obviously, if you take things even further than that, if you run something that has a really powerful tap effect, Yisan Wander Bard, Captain Sisay, Selvala Explorer Returned, you're going to start doing really silly things like Captain Sisay tap, find a legendary creature, cast a legendary creature, untap as Captain Sisay, untap all your mana dorks, play something else, tap her, get something else, play that card, untap her, just go through your entire deck essentially. Selvala Returned, again, same thing, tap her, draw a card, make a lot of mana, keep doing it over and over again, just play out your entire deck. Or you could just do like easier stuff with Isochron Scepter, imprint a lightning bolt on it, and then have any non-lands that taps for 2+ mana like Sol Ring. So you play the lightning bolt by paying the Sol Ring costs, and then you untap everything, do it again, infinite burn. It's silly. Paradox Engine is silly.
First question for you, Tomer, and I have a couple. Question one, is there any chance this is just too good, and this could be something that could end up being banned? Like, is it that type of good, or is it just like a solid commander card?
It feels like a combo piece. Honestly, I don't think people are going to be using it just for random value, even though you totally could. But I feel like it's just going to be slotting into Isochron Scepter decks. It's going to be slotting into Captain Sisay decks, Selvala decks, those type of decks to just enable like a quick win. And I don't know. I don't think it's going to be banned. I think it requires some work. It's 5 mana. It doesn't really do anything by itself, and you really do need to have a certain deck built around it to do crazy thing. The nice thing about Paradox Engine, though, is there's just so many synergies and potentials out there, and it's so flexible and it's so open-ended that so many different types of decks are going to find cool ways of abusing it. But I don't think it's going to be banned. I think it's really good, but I don't think it'll be banned.
Okay, so you mentioned Captain Sisay, all these different decks. I also want to mention like Storm combo decks. It's super amazing in any sort of combo deck like that. But my last question about Paradox Engine, so think of our typical Commander Clash decks. And the way I read Paradox Engine at its most basic form is your spells cost X less to cast, where X is the number of mana rocks you have. So if you have 3 mana rocks, each of your spells cost 3 less to cast because you untap those 3 mana rocks whenever you cast a spell. So think of our typical Commander Clash deck. We have 10, 12, maybe mana rocks in an average Commander Clash deck. Is there any chance you're just playing Paradox Engine with the text I just described? Get a couple of mana rocks down, it makes your spells cheaper, because every time you cast something, you get X amount of mana back from your mana rocks untapping.
I believe it's worth it. Like, if you have about 10 mana rocks in your deck, and a lot of non-green decks do have that number of them, then Paradox Engine is a really good card to be playing with, I think. It's like basically it's like a Voltaic Key, except it's a huge granddaddy version of the Voltaic Key, and that's really, really exciting. And then green decks that are heavily on mana dorks are going to love this too. Most green decks that I come across run like Rampant Growth, Cultivate, and stuff to make sure that the deck is resilient to board wipes. But there are decks like, for example, like Seton, Selvala, any Elf Ball deck, for example, are going to be really heavy on mana dorks. Derevi is going to be also heavy on mana dorks. So there's obvious synergies there as well.
So, last question with Paradox Engine. Pretend that it is a bulk mythic, so cost is not a concern. What percentage of your Commander Clash decks do you think would have a Paradox Engine? Like, is it close to every deck just because you're usually playing mana rocks and stuff? Is it just that kind of card that you want in a really high percentage, or not really?
I would say half, because to be honest, right now, most of my green decks don't run mana dorks. I do rely heavily on Cultivates, on Rampant Growth, on Farseeks, and I don't run Mana Rocks because, again, I'm just trying to keep my board resilient to removal. So Paradox Engine is not going to get that much value in basically my green decks that don't have mana dorks and don't have mana rocks.
Well, follow-up question then. Is it a card that's good enough that would make you consider reworking your green decks to take advantage of it? Or not really, you'd stick with Cultivates and stuff like that?
It will also depend on how much hate I expect to get from it too. I feel like the first couple times someone plays Paradox Engine, you're not really sure what it's capable of, and then it kind of catches people by surprise, and you win the game off Paradox Engine, and everybody's happy. But then, like, third and fourth time that you're running Paradox Engine, I assume people are just going to go at you immediately. So maybe the hate is not worth it unless you're really looking to combo off of it. I think my answer would still be like a half my decks. The decks that aren't running green, or the decks that are green that are running a lot of mana dorks.
I think that is one of the problems with Paradox Engine is even if you are playing it fairly, quote unquote, where you're untapping a couple mana rocks to make your spells cheaper, the rest of your table isn't necessarily going to believe or trust that. I'm pretty sure that people are going to get burnt by this card and people going infinite, and then as soon as they see someone play Paradox Engine, like you said, they're going to go after you, because even though you might be playing it fairly just to make a little extra mana, after you get killed by some infinite combo with Paradox Engine enough times, people aren't going to care, and they're just going to go after you, and you're not going to be able to convince the rest of the table that I'm not doing it that way, because because it's just such a scary card on its face because of what it could do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like Aetherflux Reservoir. You could play Aetherflux Reservoir just to gain some life, and it's efficient at what it does. But it also says right on the card that you could pay 50 life to basically kill somebody. Paradox Engine does not say that, so I think people are initially going to not worry too much about it. But as soon as you show them that you win convincingly with Paradox Engine, then you're going to start getting targeted. So you shouldn't play it just fairly. But if you do have a lot of mana rocks, like we said, 10 or more, just go for it. You're probably going to win the game anyway, even if you get a target on your head.
Well, that brings us to the end of our top 10 commander cards from Aether Revolt. So, Tomer, any final thoughts on anything on the way out the door?
I will say that this top 10 ranking is very loose and very much just basically what I'm most excited to play with. So some cards that you think probably should have been on the list but aren't, I probably would agree with you. I counted, and on top of the 10 that we mentioned here, I have 15 other cards that I'm really excited about. 15! I didn't even mention like Planar Bridge, Disallow, Whir of Invention, the Yaheni card. There's a lot of really, really solid cards in this set. And it would have been impossible to talk about them. I think we've been talking about it for like over an hour already. We probably wanted to go for 30 minutes. So just keep in mind, there's a lot of really good cards here. Check out the list, and just get hyped, guys. It's really good.
Yeah, and when it comes right down to it, that's what Commander is all about. This is the 10 cards Tomer and I, to some extent, are most excited about playing, and that's what the entire format of Commander is about, is just playing cards that you like. It's not like Standard or Modern, where you have these lists of tier cards and this metagame and net decking. Like, at its heart, the reason Commander came into existence was to let players play anything they wanted to, so I think that's the perfect way to construct a list of top Commander cards, is have it be your personal list, because it is going to vary from player to player, based on play style and based on what you're personally excited about. So I think that's the ideal way to do a Commander countdown. So, and also I wanted to mention, if you want more Commander Aether Revolt review stuff, you have some articles on the website, right, Tomer?
Yep, I have part 1 of the Commander review, and hopefully part 2 is going to be up by the time this goes up. So you can see all the cards that I'm excited about, actually more than 25 of them, actually. So if you want to see a very in-depth article about it, then check those out.
Yeah, I will throw a link in the description to this video, so if you want more discussion of more cards from Aether Revolt and Commander, make sure to check those out. Anyway, Tomer, thanks so much for hanging out and doing this. It's always a fun time to talk Commander when a new set comes out.
Always a pleasure, man. These are a lot of fun.
And thanks to everyone else for watching. So I think that wraps it up for today, and we'll be back in a couple months to talk Amonkhet. We'll talk to you soon.